with me, special guest today, it's Simon Tedeschi. Hi, Simon.
Hi,
thank you for joining us.
Absolute pleasure. Lovely to see you, in a manner of speaking.
Indeed, indeed, as close as we can get. But great to have you here. Simon Tedeschi, of course, one of Australia's most well-known and most well-loved pianists and personalities in the music world too, not just for being himself, but sometimes playing others. We'll get to that in a minute. Lovely to have you there. First, I have to ask you, how are you going with this weirdness, this strange environment that we find ourselves in at the moment?
I am, I guess, both good and bad. I'm good in that musicians such as yourself, so you understand this, spend a lot of time by ourselves. So it hasn't really changed our lifestyle as such, but of course it's completely eliminated our income. So it's been a mixture of good and bad. I just consider myself lucky that I'm not like some of my colleagues who are living sort of gig to gig, and that's particularly difficult. But yeah, it's a big challenge for those of us without job security. My wife is an artist and painter, and she's also noticed a challenge. So yeah, it's things are just being relaxed today in terms of restrictions. Hopefully, it's not too soon. So
yes,
we'll see.
Yes, we're all mindful of not counting our chickens or our chicken soup, as the case may be.
Yeah.
But having said that, being resourceful in isolation and in this kind of environment is what artists do. And it's interesting seeing that I think the general public is starting to get a feel for what they're missing. I suspect when we get out of this on the other side, they'll be ravenous for live performance.
Oh, they'll be ravenous. I think it'll just be, it'll be mad. I mean, I have a whole tour with John Bell, which has been moved to the end of the year. And I think it will be very, very highly attended. I'm hoping so. But I think that simply any music, any entertainment will just be thirsted for in society. And hopefully a certain kind of recalibration of priorities in society. I mean, I love sport as much as any man, but I love art more. And I hope that it's leveled out a little bit.
Yes, yes. Oh, yes. I hear you. That's my view as well. Love my sport, but it is funny watching television running 5 minutes of news on something that's not happening. There's more music happening than there is sport.
I know, and it's frustrating. I mean, Australia is such a sporting country, and it always will be. But at the same time, Australia is an artistic country as well. We mustn't minimise that.
Indeed. I'm going to ask you actually about that project now. I'm going to do this in reverse because I'm actually curious, since you mentioned the John Bell project that you're working on. Tell us a bit more about that. How does that work? And when we get to the other side, we'll be looking forward to seeing that. What's the idea with that?
Well, I started working with John Bell through an interesting project called Enoch Arden. And Enoch Arden was a poem written by Tennyson and set to music by Richard Strauss. And it's for narrator and piano. And it worked so well together that we went on to a new project called Bright Star, based on the lives of Schubert and John Keats, Bright Star being one of John Keats's great poems. And then we continued working together on a show called Echoes of the Jazz Age, which is based on the Scott Fitzgerald essay. And John plays Scott Fitzgerald amongst other people. I play various people. I mean, obviously the pianist, and we're joined by Blasey Best on voice, who is a wonderful singer.
Yes.
And she plays a whole range of characters, and it's basically just capturing the I suppose in many respects, the great time of American music, but also hints of the beginning of the end in many respects, because it's a dark time as well in terms of the wars that would come. So it's a mixed bag, but it's got a lot of poetry like T.S. Eliot. It's got all kinds of things.
I love the idea of that. My background with the Renaissance players used to very much involve a lot of performing of poetry. And sometimes naughty stories and character work too, but with really interesting music and unusual early music. So I'll be there.
Fantastic.
I'll be there to see that. That sounds fantastic what you're describing with John and Blasey. Now, interesting, of course, that you mentioned character work there too, because unlike most concert performers, you love getting into costume and performing. And I'm going to take you right back because I think you first came to prominence Am I right? At 9 years old, is that correct?
Yeah, 8 or 9. In fact, I was debating this very point with my mum as a joke today, but it was 9. 9 years and 3 months. She remembers very well. And I won the Open Age Mozart competition at Sydney Opera House. And that's kind of how it happened.
But beyond that, we start to, we think of Simon Tedeschi also actually dressed as Mozart sometimes too. So am I correct that there's been some of that along the way?
Yeah, that started when I was 14, 15. I played young Mozart in a series called Mozart by Moonlight at the Botanic Gardens, which was very popular. And then many, many years later, I was asked by Sydney Opera House to play Mozart in a show called Meeting Mozart, which has actually become a huge international success. And to the extent that we're up to our 8th or 9th year doing it now, and we've done it in all kinds of countries. We're doing it in London next year, and we did it in the Sydney Opera House. And in fact, you can actually see it on the Sydney Opera House website, I believe, for free at the moment.
And I think a Baby Proms version too, because I have some friends who have spotted you doing exactly that.
Yeah, in fact, the first few seasons were a part of the Baby's Proms thing, and then the season that we did last year was just as part of its own thing. But it's a wonderful show, and it's something that's open for kids and adults as well. It's hilarious, and it dramatizes Mozart, and it makes it very funny, but it doesn't dumb it down in any way, which is what I like.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, of course, some people will remember this, but I have to ask you, since it's not just dressing up and not just your face that we see, but there was a very famous movie, of course, where we saw your hands prominently. That's a lovely story. Tell me about that, because Shine was was a breakthrough movie, I think, probably for Geoffrey Rush as well too. But what an interesting angle to be part of the David Helfgott story. Fill us in on that, because that's amazing.
I was in year 8 in a cathedral school, being a good Jewish boy. Of course, I went to a cathedral school just so I can inject some kind of inequality to the divinity class.
Quite right.
And I was asked initially to audition for the part of young David, but I may be a bit of a funny man on stage, but I'm definitely not a dramatic actor. And I was far too young, and it was dreadful. Liz Mulliner, who was the casting agent at the time, she I could tell it didn't go very well. But then, as it turned out, she needed somebody with kind of white hands that looked like they belonged to a young Jewish boy. But I was too white, so they had to cover me. They had to make me look more olive.
Oh, that's funny.
It was funny. So I had layers of makeup.
And presumably Noah Taylor. I think was it Noah Taylor was not quite the concert pianist that was required.
No, it was actually the very young David. So it was Alex Rafalowitz.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, in that a Stedford scene,
yes.
And where the piano is being, seemingly pushed back by David, but it was being pulled back by some guy. And I had to, because it was a low budget thing, I had to wear the same dressing gown or whatever it was as David, and I had to play inside his sleeves. So I had to sit behind the boy and play inside his sleeves, while he would often move in a way contrary to the way the music went. So it was very difficult. It was freezing cold as well.
But interesting insight into the difficulties of filming these sorts of things with a single camera.
Yeah, and I had no idea, but unbelievably boring. Sometimes waiting 14 hours, just waiting and waiting and waiting, because it was extraordinary amount of waiting for your time to be shooting. It's just
yes.
You have to pass time. It's unbelievable.
Yes, well, that's quite the education for a young performer, but very interesting. But of course, in the time since then, there's been so much television for you, recording, of course, some famous recordings. What would you say? I mean, it's a curious thing about young stars and whether they cross over. I know, especially for young singers, when voices break and things like that. But what for you was the challenge of making that jump between the shooting young star and the mature artist?
It was very difficult in many ways, because when you're constantly regaled as being wonderful when you're young, it's not necessarily very healthy for the psyche. But equally, the other
Although
side
a Jewish
is not.
boy may well be used to it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was difficult, and you have to, in many respects, when you're an adult, try to capture the stuff you found easy when you were young, which is that kind of effortlessness, that ability to just toss off a phrase. Yeah, you have to rethink everything, and it's definitely tricky. But I mean, I'm pushing 40 now, and I'm still. I'm wondering how long it'll be before I'm stopped being called a prodigy. I mean, it's unbelievable, really. I mean, I'll probably be on my deathbed and I'll still be like, oh yes, he was the prodigy, So
maybe the boyish looks will follow you around, and you'll be fine, Simon. You'll be fine. Yeah.
Maybe.
What for you? I mean, there's been so many, and of course, recording. We've talked about that, and broadcast, and interesting audiences, I suppose. What for you have been some highlights? First of all, in terms of performing, but secondly, in terms of audiences that you might have performed for.
Well, definitely the biggest audience I've ever played for was 100,000 people, and that was at the Domain with the Sydney Symphony.
Oh, wow.
I was playing Shostakovich No. 2, and that was. I mean, for anyone old enough, I was introduced by Tim Shaw, who was the Demtel guy.
Yes, I remember him well.
It's just bizarre.
But wait, there's more. That sort of
thing.
Yeah,
it was bizarre. And then performing in the Opera House is always spectacular for me. It's I never get sick of it, ever. I love Sydney Town Hall too, because I think it's such an extraordinary building. And performing in Carnegie Hall was an amazing event too, for obvious reasons. But I like performing in very small venues. I mean, I think it's wonderful. I like doing the Mozart show because it's in a theatre as opposed to a hall, and that's a different feeling in itself. And I love playing in all of the different halls in China because there's so many cities and so many halls, and I mean, it's just the size of that country. I just can't get over.
What about some of the people that you've performed for? Because whether it's large audiences or they're smaller ones, there have been some real VIPs among your audiences. Take us through some of those, because that's
well, people I've performed with were very exciting. I was Larry Adler's last pianist, the harmonica genius, and we toured the world together. That was very special. I mean, he was kind of a throwback to, I suppose, Golden Age Hollywood. Definitely his ego was a throwback to Golden Age. Performing with some amazing people, and performing for some amazing people, of course, who I didn't get to meet because I was important enough to perform for them but not to meet them. Like the Dalai Lama, Putin. He clearly liked my performance because I'm still here talking to you. The Chinese leader at the time, the Shinzo Abe, the Barack Obama.
Oh.
Yeah.
These are fantastic memories. And as you said, you are only pushing 40. So, young man, these are rather amazing achievements. We can call you prodigy as long as that lasts. I think that sounds fine. You'll have to wear that, Simon.
It's sort of turned into a joke now. Even my brother says, "Oh, how's the child prodigy going?"
Good stuff. Let's move on to some other fun stuff, actually, because what I want to ask you, is there something that you'd like to play for us? Or, well, I'll start with that, and then we'll ask you about some other things, some fun things that you enjoy listening to or hearing.
Well, I'm happy to play whatever you want. Name a composer. I'll try and play.
Ooh, well, what should we go with? You know what I'm going to say? I'm going to say Gershwin. We haven't mentioned Gershwin yet, but your Gershwin recordings are just legend in Australia. There's been a couple of albums. Let's have some Gershwin. Thank you.
Sure.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much. A lovely treat for us to get. Unexpected. Thank you. And off the top of your head. How do you find that crossover? Because it's an interesting thing, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned the theatrical side of things and your, we're going to say Catholic tastes, I think, as well, given the cathedral school background. But, you know, a crossover, jazz, Gershwin.
Gershwin, I've always found, I suppose, more classical than jazz because he had such a strong classical background. I mean, Rachmaninoff, Grieg, Schumann, it's all in there. But the only difference with Gershwin, as I see it, is that he used the language of the blues. But you don't really have to be able to play the blues or swing like a jazz musician, and that's difficult when you get into that thing. And I can sort of do it, but I wouldn't call myself a jazz musician because you really need to be of that tradition to have really grown up with it, to have it in your body as such. But I can jam and pretend that I'm a jazz musician. And certainly Gershwin has helped. Later this year, if this awful virus has gone away, I'll be playing Gershwin Concerto in F with the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. And that'll be very exciting because that's kind of like a little bit like Grapstein Blue, but more of Gershwin writing a serious piano concerto. So it's got Ravel in it, and it's actually got some Rachmaninoff in it too. It's fascinating.
Lots of fun in there as well too. And I'm going to take you now to mentioning, because I think we're going to actually show along with this little chat some of your favourite pieces, including some poetry. But I want to ask about Dudley Moore, because you've mentioned the Dudley Moore piece as something, I think even something actually recorded in Melbourne. But tell me about what you think of Dudley Moore.
Oh, I think Dudley Moore is an incredible genius. It's not really cool in jazz to say you like Dudley Moore. And I think that there's this strange thing us humans have. If you get really, really, really popular, people start to think, oh, maybe he's not good or something. But I mean, he's such a genius. And the fact is that he could play jazz so well, but he was also very funny. And he was also a great actor. And he was one of these, dreaded people who seem to be good at everything they do. And that's Dudley Moore. He's definitely one of my absolute heroes.
We'll play that Scheherazade that he jazzes up in Melbourne a couple of years back, along with our chat today, and people can enjoy that as well too. Tell us about your love of poetry too. Not always light, sometimes dark as well too.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting extensions in this house, and you'll see why, because I kind of have a problem. So I just love reading in general, but I suppose my favorite poet is Paul Celan. I mean, without a doubt, he's my favorite writer, and he was a Romanian. Well, I suppose you say Romanian, but he was sort of in that. He could be Romanian, but he was of, he had a German background. He was obviously Jewish, but he had a lot of influence from the Russian school as well. And he's probably the most tragic and one of the darkest poets. And he's really the poet of the Holocaust, because he felt after the Second World War that language had to be completely remade in order to deal with what happened. It couldn't remain the same, especially how language had been bastardized by Germany. So he wrote poetry he took it to a place that it's never been before. And the poem that has most touched me lately is Todesfuge, which is Death Fugue. It's extremely dark, so I'd advise people who are obviously affected by these things, as we all are, but very affected to it's a very, very dark poem, and especially the way he reads it is like an incantation. It's extraordinary.
Well, for those who are feeling strong and want to look at that, we will link to that as well too. There's a performance by the poet of that piece, and it's quite affecting. Let's move to something else. Some of your favourite musicians and performances that you've enjoyed as well too over the years.
Yeah. Look. One of my very favorite pianists is Friedrich Gulda. He was an Austrian, and he was in that period of really post Second World War Austria, where there was some amazing art being done, and he he was a classical pianist who could play Mozart and Beethoven as well, if not better than anyone. But also he had these amazing collaborations with people like Herbie Hancock and Joe Zawinul of Weather Report, which you know, now everything's about cross-fertilization, but back then he was like way ahead of the curve, and some amazing collaborations that are just yeah, I mean, I still watch them and I think wow, what a tradition he was setting up. He was really even before Nigel Kennedy. I mean, it's incredible.
Indeed.
And the video that I've linked to is the whole concert. It's this amazing concert, and you see Gulda wearing what looks like a fez on stage. It's really weird. And then you see Joe Zawinul, who's this very sort of muscular-looking guy who looks like a dock worker, but he's one of the great jazz players of the 20th century. And they're these two very strange geniuses playing together in concert. And I just think, what an amazing collaboration.
Well, we shall commend our viewers and listeners to that Vienna recording as well too, and they can take a look and enjoy that, having been recommended to it by Simon Tedeschi. Do you want to play something else for us before we finish off for the moment? Let's go back to something classical, but you choose.
Sure. I can play a little bit of Bach if you want.
Bach would be lovely.
All right. That's the beginning of the Chromatic Fantasy and Fugue by Bach.
Absolutely beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. It's a lovely gift to us to have a little bit of that in our isolation, as indeed in yours. Simon, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been just lovely to chat with you, if only briefly, but to get a bit of a window into what it's like for the artist at the moment, but also to hear from you and hear some of those lovely stories and to connect with some of your favourites as well.
Absolutely love your cat. What a beautiful.
Well, Rory may well make an appearance, if not in this chat, in one later in the series. He's a musical cat, so he'd appreciate a little duet. Maybe the Rossini.
Oh yeah.
Duet. Oh yes. Well, I was thinking the duet for two cats. The meow, that one there, but that's for another time. We'll need a mezzo for that. Yeah. Simon, lovely to speak with you. Thank you so much for joining us again. Take care, keep safe, keep well, and we will doubtless see you on the other side.
See you, Geoff.
Cheers.